Welcome to Paul Ricard, home of the French Grand Prix. And as the sun starts to set here on Friday, the big talking point has been nothing to do with what happened on track today. And incidentally, Valtteri Bottas was fastest for Mercedes, but what happened in the Canadian Grand Prix. Of course, Sebastian Vettel was given a 5-second penalty that cost him victory and promoted Lewis Hamilton to the win. Now, Ferrari have petitioned for the right to a review. Now, that meant that today, the Canadian Grand Prix stewards were reconvened to hear whether Ferrari really did have some new evidence that was considered significant and relevant. Had they proved that, that would have meant that the official review hearing could then have happened. As it happens, that didn't happen, and Ferrari's attempt was thrown out. So the Canadian Grand Prix result will stand. There will be no review. I'm joined by Scott Mitchell to discuss the reasons behind this, but first I'm going to read out the list of 7 bits of new evidence that Ferrari attempted to prove to the stewards that this should be open to review. So I have my trusty notebook here. So item 1, telemetry channels. Now that included car attitude channels, so that could judge the dynamics of the car, what Vettel was reacting to. Item 2, video analysis of camera view, so that's just your basic analysis of what happened in the incident. Item 3, Sky Sports F1 coverage, Karun Chandhok's video analysis of the incident. He of course felt it shouldn't have been a penalty. Ferrari evidently liked that. Number 4 was Vettel's face camera, so that's the camera pointing back towards his helmet. We didn't see that in the coverage, but we did see it after. Item 5, post-race and video images, so that's photographs, that kind of thing, items that Ferrari felt were not available at the time. Number 6, GPS analysis of the racing line and Vettel and Hamilton, and this could be compared to what they did on previous laps as well. And item 7, Sebastian Vettel's witness statement. Obviously the argument there would have been, well, Vettel was in the car when he had the penalty, so he couldn't give an official witness statement. So Scott, perhaps you can explain why these 7 items between them did not convince the stewards that it was worth a review.
Well, Ferrari felt that they had what they described as quite overwhelming evidence in their favour. So they were obviously quite confident. They wouldn't have brought the review, I suppose, if they weren't confident. But the FIA, the stewards, didn't quite share that they weren't quite as convinced, shall we say. And what the FIA said is that, as you pointed out, Ferrari needed to convince them that they had new and relevant evidence. And of those 7 points, 5 of them were dismissed out of hand as not new or relevant. The 2 that were considered new were Chandhok's testimony in the Sky Sports coverage and the camera that faces towards Vettel. So the one that looks back at him from almost behind the steering wheel. The problem for Ferrari is that even though they were considered new, they weren't considered relevant. So from Chandhok's side, it was dismissed because it was a third-party opinion, and the camera was deemed to have shown nothing that they couldn't see from other footage. So unfortunately, they were 0 for 7 for Ferrari in terms of what they needed to convince the stewards, and it's a shame because it's a shame for them because obviously they felt that they should get to a review because then they'd be able to argue it, but the stewards deemed that they had basically nothing new or relevant compared to what they had at the time when they made the decision.
And it's a key distinction that this was not the review, isn't it? It shows that Ferrari was so far away from being able to make something work that they didn't even get through the door, as it were. So they thought it was overwhelming evidence. It actually proved to be pretty underwhelming. Actually, looking at the list and knowing how much data the stewards have, okay, they only had a short amount of time, I think about 15 minutes, wasn't it?
12 minutes,
12 minutes, okay, good stat there, to decide. They've got access to huge amounts of footage, they've got CCTV footage, they've got data. An enormous amount of data actually is piped through the F1 production studio, as it were, which is behind us over there. So there's an enormous amount of data that is instantly accessible, and I think certainly people on the outside underestimate that. Maybe Ferrari underestimate that too.
Yeah, I think that is possible. I just think they got a bit carried away with what they felt was new, and that's the key. It's the devil's in the detail. The key is always to convince the decision makers that they've got something new or relevant. And I suppose as well from the FIA's point of view, with the amount of information they've got, the wealth of data that they've got at their fingertips, I would even argue they probably don't even need to prove that they looked at it. We discussed this earlier when you pointed out that they just need to prove that it was there. It was available to them. They obviously didn't consider it relevant, otherwise it would have been looked at the time. So yeah, Ferrari just fell foul of it, and the reaction was short but sweet, shall we say, from Mattia Binotto. He described himself as disappointed for Ferrari, disappointed for their fans, and disappointed for the sport as a whole, which is obviously quite strong, and it fits with the rhetoric from Ferrari that they expected the decision to be redone. And Vettel said just burn the rule book. Like if that was his suggestion. It was asked what it was. Obviously, he said he was disappointed. Then he was asked how would you change it, and he said, well, how can you change it? Because these are the rules. This is what we've all pushed F1 towards. So if you want to change it, set fire to the rule book.
Well, ultimately, this was a question of the rule book, and we should say the FIA stewards were judging to that rule book, and we should add, I don't think this was a fait accompli. It wasn't that this hearing happened and there was never going to be any serious consideration given. 3 of the stewards were here in person, 1 was here by a phone connection, so they were putting time in. 3 people don't travel all the way here for no reason. They came into it with open minds, wanted to look at the evidence, were willing to. Obviously, they felt their decision was right, but a lot of effort has been gone to here to review this, or to review the potential right, the petition to review. We should say that technicality again. So, I think no matter what you think about the decision and what you think about the rule books, personally, I feel the stewards' hands were tied unnecessarily on this one, and it could have been let slide. But the stewards actually have played it correctly, in my opinion, because I don't think the original decision was outrageous considering the rules, and I don't think that the rejection of the petition to review was wrong given those 7 items we discussed.
No, I agree. And the hearing today, the hearing to consider whether the review should happen, important distinction.
The hearing to trip us up with awkward phraseology is the actual.
Exactly. The hearing today is sort of split opinion in the paddock. We've been obviously canvassing as much opinion between the drivers and the team bosses as possible, and it's quite interesting to get everybody's takes, because the general consensus does appear to be, professionally, from a driver point of view and a team point of view, that it was harsh in a racing context to give Vettel that penalty. But you don't apply a penalty because of racing logic. You apply a penalty because of the rule book, as you said. And almost to a person, actually, in the paddock, the agreement seems to be, I don't think Vettel should have got a penalty, but the way the rules are written, he should have got a penalty. They don't like it, but they have to go along with it. And it's also, the other thing that's kicked off is this debate over whether the rules need changing, but also whether this right to review should exist. So Zach Brown at McLaren F1 CEO and Fred Vasseur, the Alfa Romeo team boss, they both raised the point that 12 days after the event, and they didn't want to comment specifically on the Ferrari case, but we're using it as the example because it's the reason we're talking about it. This hearing today, just to see if there was going to be a review, took place 12 days after the Canadian Grand Prix itself. And then maybe the hearing wouldn't have, maybe the review that it triggered wouldn't have taken place until tomorrow, or it would have gone in late into night today, and we would still be talking about it over the course of the weekend. And it's a fortnight after the race. So the argument that Zach Brown and Fred Vasseur were putting forward was, that's way too long. And I know that there needs to be this element in the regulations where you can contest something, because imagine if the example that our colleague Jonathan Noble gave earlier when we were all discussing it as a group was that imagine if a driver wins a pivotal season finale and it wins them the championship, and then 7 days later it emerges that the car is heinously illegal. But no, the rules are set in, the results set in stone, and it can't be altered after the 2 hours after the flag. That's obviously a problem. But the argument from Vasseur and Brown was very much, it's confusing. You don't want that as a fan. You don't want to go away from the track thinking someone's won and then the next day or 2 weeks later it changes. So it has triggered a multi-layered debate now within F1. And while this is the end of it, Mattia Binotto says this is the end of it from Ferrari's perspective in terms of this particular penalty, I'm not entirely convinced it's the end of the matter as a whole.
Well, it is a trigger for discussions about that kind of thing. It's also a trigger for the GPDA to get involved in this right to race thing. There's a lot of drivers saying they want to be able to be allowed to get away with that and only punish the really over-the-top moments. So those discussions will be ongoing. This could go down as a significant petition to review, got the phraseology right there, even though the result was ultimately nothing for Ferrari.